The following podcast with Dayannara and Muñoz aired on the Move the Needle podcast, hosted by Mike Sullivan and Hunter Eisenhower. Be sure to check out the MTN podcast and please enjoy this interview with Coach Day.
Hey everyone, if you like the Fitness Daily, just know that it's brought to you by Zor Fitness. At Zor Fitness, we offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for athletes and coaches. You can find it all in one place, zorfitness.com.
Welcome to Move the Needle, the human performance podcast with your hosts, Hunter Eisenhower and Mike Sullivan. Joining us on the pod today is Dayannara Muñoz. Day is an athletic performance coach at the University of Arizona and has one of the most impressive and unique backgrounds in anyone in performance, and we were incredibly lucky to have her on as a guest today. Starting with a chemical engineering degree from MIT, a master's from Columbia, commissioning as an officer into the Air Force, and now working her way through her doctorate in immunobiology, Day's background and interests make her an incredible part of the performance field. On the episode today, we dive into her doctorate work within immunobiology, the J-curve of risk of infection and exercise intensity, and she takes us through the interference effect and planning effective training.
Even though we don't usually start with this, we're going to start with this with you because I think it's really interesting. So it's unique and it's also a very impressive background. And we both are really interested in hearing, and I think a lot of the people listening to this would be blown away by hearing some of like your background and some of the credentials that you have. So can you kind of just like talk about your path and how it led you to the different places that you've been along your journey, and then how you ultimately ended up at Arizona and the job you have now?
Yeah. So I know every time I like apply for a job and all that, I use the cover letter to kind of like describe why my resume is kind of all over the place. It's kind of like, all right, just hear me out. There's a method to the madness. But growing up, I was more on the academic side than I was on the athletic side. And then just growing up with my family, it's like first generation in the United States and all that stuff. They're Puerto Rican. So sports wasn't a big thing. So I gravitated more towards academics. So I wanted to be an engineer. I was like, all right, I'll go to school for engineering. I know there's security there financially, and I don't know exactly what it entails, but it sounds like it'll be good. So I have anyone who knows me knows that I have kind of like an addictive, obsessive personality. So as I went through school and all that stuff, I was like, okay, I'm just going to study all the way through, like really get my head into the books. And luckily, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend MIT, so Massachusetts Institute of Technology over in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm from Massachusetts, so it was close to home too. So that was nice. And while I was there, I studied chemical engineering. So I did chemical engineering, and during my 4 years, I did a lot of research that ranged from like chemical engineering stuff, that's typical bioreactors and all that. But I try to center it around like nutrition. So I did a lot of gut metabolism using bioreactors, and if you were to ask me the details of that research project that took up 2 years of my life, I wouldn't be able to give you much, just because it's like completely wiped out of my head now. And then I also was doing Air Force ROTC. So they paid for my school, and I was able to, once I graduated, commission into the Air Force. And I was placed, oddly enough, as an aircraft maintenance officer. Essentially, I did a lot of project management and logistics work for the Air Force instead of engineering. So I found that kind of weird. But during my college time, I was also taking a lot of extra courses, exercise science, just on my own, because I started really getting into performance for the military. I went in from high school to college. I weighed a whopping 90 pounds. So I definitely needed to put on some weight. And I figured the right way to do it is just, gain some muscle. And then through that, like I became obsessed with this. So while I was in college, started taking all these courses and all that, learning about it, got certified as like a personal trainer at first, and started doing like, personal training as a side gig. While I was active duty in the Air Force, I started doing strength coaching on the side, part-time in the private sector. So that's where I started dabbling in it, knowing that I had to do 4 years in the Air Force. I did my contract up. I'm currently in the reserves right now, so part-time. But then once I was done with my full-time commitment, I was able to go part-time and then go full-time into strength coach mode. So during that time, I worked in the private sector for about 2 years, 1 to 2 years, full-time, and then found myself in Arizona at the University of Arizona. And I was lucky too, because I was actually stationed here in Tucson at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. And I was lucky enough that I was able to stay here, right place, right time, a position opened up. And yeah, that's where I'm at right now.
So you needed more academic load in terms of learning about the athletic side of things in addition to your academic load of chemical engineering at MIT.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
That's how.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, typically most strength coaches go chemical engineering and then follow a similar path. Me and Mike talked about a couple times preparing for this podcast that you're way too smart for both of us. So we'll try not to ask you super remedial questions. But one question I had is, you said you're obsessive personality, which I think to a certain degree I can relate with. Do you find yourself like still feeling the itch of like the chemical engineering side of things, or has the strength and conditioning obsession just like completely wiped that out and taken over?
Yeah, I would say the chemical engineering side of things kind of, went to the wayside because I never actually fell in love with it as much, right? Like I liked it, but it wasn't until like my junior year when you're in the thick of it where I'm like, oh man, I really don't want to do this for the rest of my life. But I'm 3 years in. I literally only have a few more like major courses left. I'm just gonna chug through. Um, so really went into exercise physiology. I still kept the science in it, strength and conditioning and all that. And I think that's what led me to going back to school right now for my PhD. So, I was able to, because I still like science. I'm a very science person, if you want to say that. I don't know what a good term is, but I like science a lot. So I was able to, finish that up and know that chemical engineering wasn't for me. I really like performance optimization, exercise physiology, strength and conditioning. I could go to school for that and get that science itch.
So before we segue into your PhD, so you went from MIT, you commissioned to the Air Force. So how did you end up going back to Columbia for your master's degree?
Yeah, so that was I was pretty fortunate with that one as well. It was in the military, the job I had was very project management focused. So this master's program that I went to was very focused on like data analytics and management of like information management. So that actually worked out really well because it was like a hybrid program. So I was able to take some time, go to New York for a bit to do like the in-person requirements, and then the online requirements. I was able to do it throughout the year and it's meant for like working professionals essentially.
Got you. So certainly you don't need to do more schooling if you're going to work in performance, right? I mean, you've probably done as much schooling as you possibly want to. However, you continue to do that. You're now, like you talked about, you're getting your PhD right now at Arizona, right? So, what made you decide to go back to school? Because again, like you've reached that limit for potential performance, right? So, what made you want to go back? And then also, what are you diving into? I know you said it was immunobiology, but let's dive into the why and let's dive into the what a little bit.
Yeah. So I want to go back to school for one. I like learning. It's just, I just like it. I like learning more and having those opportunities. But one is another reason, like I really want to go into like exercise physiology, sport science-y type fields. And I think when you have that interest, a lot of times people have interest in doing research too. And when you're going to school for a PhD, you have the opportunity to do research. So I'm able to carry out that as well and get experience in that. So eventually, when I transition from being a strength coach to an exercise physiologist, sports scientist, I'll have that background. And I think it's a good segue too for that because I think having that strength and conditioning background and being a strength coach is like awesome for it because it's really has helped me out with what I'm doing in the lab now and what I'm doing in my courses. So yeah, so right now, as you mentioned, I'm working in a lab that is focused on immunobiology on top of like the courses that you have to take for the physiology program. But this lab specifically, it's pretty cool because the professor who runs it, he's a former special forces in I forgot what, he's from Scotland, so I think it's the Scotland Armed Forces. He was special forces, and then he transitioned out of there, went to school, and he's a huge like endurance athlete. He does triathlons, he's a cycler and all that stuff. So he really has a strong like focus in exercise. And in the program at the U of A, the physiology program, it's very medicine focused, like medical, which is great, right? Like I think it's great the stuff they're doing. It's pretty cool to see like all the Alzheimer's research, diabetes, all that. But my interests lie in performance, exercise physiology. So he was the only one really that was like open to the idea when I brought it to him, like, hey, I want to do research in exercise physiology. Like that's what I want to do. And he was all about it. Where other professors were like, like they kind of shut down the idea. They're like, no, like, we're really focused on this. So he was on board, and he's also an immunobiologist. So essentially looking at how exercise affects the immune system. So I don't know if you want me to get into specifics on what I'm doing exactly in the lab. It's kind of talk about it for a long periods of time to get into the details if you'd like.
It would be really interesting to hear what you're doing.
All right, sweet. So the lab itself is mostly cancer focused. So they're looking at how exercise affects the mobility of immune cells in the bloodstream and how it could eventually be a method of blood transfusion for cancer management. And so what we do is people come in, we have participants, they do a VO2 max test. So we put them on a metabolic cart and they cycle for as long as they can, for as hard as they can, with increasing resistance, wattage, power, and we get their VO2 max. That same participant will come in a week later for another visit, and this time they're going through another protocol based on their VO2 max, and it's intervals based on their VO2 max and we get the corresponding wattage with that. At each of these intervals that range from 50% of VO2 max to 80%, we are drawing blood. So as we're drawing blood from them, we're using that blood in order to see the mobilization of immune cells. So what we notice is when someone is resting, their immune cells are at a certain level in the blood. Once they do exercise, those immune cells mobilize and the concentration in the blood of those immune cells increases. So then what we do is we get mice that have tumors or some type of cancer, and we inject these mice with let's say one mouse has the resting, the other mouse has the exercise blood injected in them, and we noticed that over a span of time, which is not too long, like days, that the tumor growth in the mice that have the exercise blood is less. So we're noticing that the mobilization of the immune cells really has an effect on the tumor growth, and it's helping. So essentially what we're trying to do is, continuously do this over and over again so that we can then bring it to clinical research and actually have it as a method of blood transfusions for cancer patients. So that's what the lab does as a whole. Then, there's people branching off in little things. So right now, what I'm doing is I'm looking at how acute stress, which is exercise, affects the immune cell mobilization for someone under chronic stress. And the reason I'm looking at that is because athletes tend to be under chronic stress, right? With all their travel, competition, school stress, all that stuff. So if they're under chronic stress, does the mobilization of the immune cells in their blood, is it acutely affected when they do exercise? Or does that chronic stress actually mask it? Because all the participants we've been doing this with, they're not under chronic stress that we know of. But if we're doing it with a population that is under chronic stress, we want to see how the mobilization is changing. And that gets into the whole topic of immunobiology that I think is pretty interesting. And it's some of us may be familiar with it. You may have heard of it, like the J curve. And you may not know the exact term, J curve, but we're all familiar with it, and we see it with our athletes. And the J curve is essentially, if you're looking at a graph, you have the y-axis and the x-axis. The y-axis is the risk of infection, and the x-axis is the amount, the intensity of exercise, or how much exercise someone's doing. So if you think of the shape of a J, if you're looking at the end of the x-axis, where someone is essentially sedentary, low exercise, their risk of infection is pretty moderate, right? It's moderate to high. But as they start doing exercise and they're reaching the moderate exercise region, that dips, right? And that's usually the general population, right? Movement is medicine. It's good for you. Exercising keeps you healthy. And then usually athletes are on the other end of the spectrum, which is the end of that J, and it shoots up because now they're doing excessive exercise, and that the risk of infection is actually extremely high. So, there's a sweet spot within how much exercise someone should be doing to live a healthy life. But what we know and what we see is that athletes are on the opposite end of the spectrum where it's not really healthy, and it's not sustainable long term for the most part. And you have to be careful with it because it does increase that rate of infection. And I know we see it a lot with with the endurance sports that I work with, which is triathlon and swim. We see it a lot, especially because the swim team is so big, that there's a certain period in the season where, in the off season in particular, where volume is so high, both in the pool and in the weight room. And it seems like everyone is getting sick. And I'm constantly getting updates from the athletic trainers like, hey, this person's going to be out. This person's going to be out. This person's going to be out. And it's all from upper respiratory infections, especially, or like colds and all that stuff. So they're at that point of the J curve where they're so high up. And, the immune cell is just essentially so weakened. So we look at a lot of stuff like that. So I think it's really cool, the correlation between exercise, the immune system, and how sometimes, something that's good like exercise could sometimes be a little bit too much and actually have the opposite effect.
Man, that's incredibly interesting, and I feel like we could,
So fascinating.
and we might spend the rest of the episode just talking about this, but it really resonates with me and hits home because I feel like maybe this year more than ever, I feel like we speaking about specifically the basketball team I work with has just dealt with more sickness than I'm used to in previous years. And what's also interesting is we have a few individuals who had and have very, very high workloads. Like if you were to look at usage rates across the country, I'm sure that 2, if not 3 of our players are probably, I don't know this to be exact, but in the top 90th percentile of usage rates of all players. And it's just interesting because we've dealt with a lot of sickness. So I guess all that to say, my question to you is, and I know that you're still in the middle of this research and it's probably not do this and you're fine, but what are some just clues, things you can see to potentially combat this issue, to know when you're talking about that J curve, to know when you get further along the x-axis to okay, this is getting too much and risk of infection is high? Are there just telltale signs of that potentially being an issue?
Yeah, I think that comes down a lot to who the athlete's communicating with most. So I know for me, a lot of the athletes are communicating with the athletic trainers, both on when I speak about the teams that I usually work with, if we're talking endurance, swim, and triathlon. Both of the athletic trainers that work with those teams, they're really good with, picking up at when, this is going to start happening. We usually see one person go down and we know what the trickle effects are going to be. But it all comes down to like load management, especially with teams like that or athletes that have such high load. And that's something that I'm like starting to really get really like into, is like managing load. And that's depending on how you manage load for your sport. So I'm assuming for basketball, you guys have some type of GPS system or like a Connexon IMU.
Yeah, we use Connexon.
Yeah, so like managing that load there and being able to kind of see, oh, hey, they're, being able to really track that data and see like when things are getting pretty excessive, right? And then I know we don't do this with our athletes, and I wish we could, but I think it's something that's really hard to do with teams and students as well, who are so preoccupied with other things beyond their sport, like school. But if we can like track, sleep and resting heart rate and HRV, I think those are really good metrics that really tell like will give you those signs like, oh, hey, you're heading towards this direction of training a little bit too much and heading towards that upper end of that J curve. And, I do it a lot on myself. I do a lot of like, little case studies on myself and all that. And I like numbers, so I'm okay with tracking every little detail. I know some people don't like that, and, they're like, that's a bit neurotic. I'm not going to do that. But I look at all those things and I tailor my like training for myself based on that. So if I'm like seeing 3 days of my resting heart rate going up by 5 beats per minute total over a span of 3 days, and my resting heart rate is going up and my HRV is going down. Usually my HRV on what I track it with is around like 120, 130, and I'm in the 80s and 90s, and it's been 3 days of that. That's a sign. And there's also subjective measurements too, right? How you're feeling, but that there is enough of a sign that I'm like, okay, this is, I'm not feeling too good. The numbers are proving it, all that. So if I were to look at metrics specifically, it would be that. And then whatever type of load tracking that you do for your specific sport.
Couple things. One thing kind of similar to Hunter's anecdote is that like our first long road trip of the season, like we're typically in a pretty high workload chronically. On our first road trip of the season, like long road trip of the season, everyone came back sick. I was like, is that a product of them just being around a ton of different people, like traveling, and like we fly commercial, so it's like they're around a ton of people, or is that just like a product of high chronic workload and then just basically a week straight of like 4 flights, 3 games, late nights, early mornings, etc. So probably a little bit of both. But what I guess the question always becomes is like, okay, if you see it happening, if like, okay, let's say you use HRV. It's like, okay, HRV would indicate to me that maybe we should start to alter training a little bit. So if I'm going to go to my sport coach and be like, hey, our HRVs have been really kind of crazy the last couple of days, or is it a 3-day marker? Is it a week-long marker? What is like the, I guess, timeline of, hey, we should start to create some intervention before we see some kind of negative effect? Because also you could be like, hey, we have this week of maybe shitty HRV. We also have 2 games this weekend. So like whatever, it is what it is, So is it like hey, it's 3 days, let's start looking at it. It's now a week. Okay, now we're definitely like we have to create intervention. Like what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, I look at 3 days for like short term and kind of getting like an initial flag, right? Like 3 days of increasing, and if it's a steady increase and it's a pretty significant increase, like if you're looking at statistically significance, right? Or you could use just like a basic like 10% increase. That's a pretty big increase. So however you want to approach it, how you want to calculate it. So 3 days raises the initial flag. And if you're close to your coach and there's someone who's open to your suggestions, and that I would bring up that initial conversation like, hey, this is something, just to put on your radar, you can make a decision on that. And then I think the week long is the week trend is what I find, the ultimate like important one, where if it's like a steady increase all week, then that's no bueno. But if you're seeing some fluctuation throughout the week, maybe it went up, it went down, and it went back up, then that could lead to some more conversations, and That's where you have to have that decision making tree of like, oh hey, we have some games coming up. We're going to need to consider that. That's priority right now. We can kind of push through, or okay, we have some time before these games. Let's kind of throttle back a bit and then adjust as we move forward. So I
So
think
for
it's
you
really
guys,
situational dependent. Oh, sorry.
no, you're good. So for you guys, like you said, you have two chronically high training volume sports, right? In
Mhm.
triathlon and swimming. So within those two sports, I'm assuming you guys don't have catapults or GPS on your triathlon team. Maybe you do. Maybe I shouldn't assume that. But what do you guys use to measure this when it seems maybe more important for a sport like this compared to? Oh, I mean, I guess it's important for every sport, but especially for this like super high workload sport.
Yeah. So I think that's interesting with these being a strength coach for these sports because the coaches handle all the conditioning and they handle that load management. So um, I know like triathlon uses an app called Training Peaks, and Training Peaks does a pretty good job when you're inputting the when the coaches put the workouts in there, their training every day. It'll pair up with their chest straps and their garments and all that, and it gets all that information. It extracts it, and then it'll at the end of the week it'll be like, hey, you spent this amount of time in this training zone, this amount of time in this training zone. So zones is a big one that they look at. Looking at overall time and mileage is really like the big three. So you're correct where they don't have like Connexons or GPS or Catapult or any of those technologies, but instead they're looking more at like the wearables that you hear a lot with, like, I don't know if like recreational runners use them too, right? Like garments and chest straps and all that stuff. So they're using more of those things. For swim, to be honest, like I don't know exactly if they have any technology that helps them track anything, but I do know that they're looking at intensities based on speed. So if an athlete's like, uh this like time trial numbers, and they're basing it off that and like increasing either intervals and distances and all that good stuff.
So from a logistical standpoint, you mentioned like Garmin and the chest straps, but what are some ways that you would suggest from like a technology standpoint to get these metrics that you were just talking about, specifically HRV and resting heart rate?
Yeah, so
And
for
like in a
those,
in a perfect world, let's just say like you're not worried about budget, you're not worried about whatever. It's just like I want to be able to do this, one, logistical in the sense of like being able to collect the data, but then also logistical in terms of like not asking your athletes to wear a chest strap 24/7 and like pretty non-invasive.
right. I think looking at the reliability and validity of all the different technologies that are out there, but when it comes to resting heart rate and HRV, as long as I have like a watch that they're wearing consistently, that's usually the best way to go. Like I have the Whoop strap, right? And super easy. I never take it off. Like I have a huge, like if you look at my suntan, it's very clear. Like I'm wearing this thing all the time. Um, and I like it in terms of tracking my trends. It's great. And whether the numbers are accurate or not, I really don't care about that, right? I care more about the trends over time. If I want someone's super accurate resting heart rate, then that's where I would get pretty bougie with what I get, trying to get that information. That's where things will start getting a little bit more invasive and contraptions involved in there. But if I'm looking for trends, like a Whoop strap is great, right? Or a Garmin watch, whatever, one of those. But though they're really good at detecting, the changes and, stress, sleep cycles, all that. So like, for example, if I decide to go out and have like a drink with my friends, like Friday night, Saturday morning, my Whoop is like, you had a drink last night, like, or you had a drink or two. And it's very clear. It's like, I'm 31. I feel it. My body feels it. And my Whoop confirms it. So it's kind of nice. So, that's, if I had perfect world, just that's where I would go. Yeah.
Well, it's funny you said that about the drink and your body confirming it, or I'm sorry, the Whoop confirming what your body's telling you, because the other question I have is, are there subjective measures that you've seen potentially in research that carry correlation to these numbers? Because I know that before I had Connexon, I was really interested in just being able to like monitor RPE as my like one of my workload metrics. And there is some correlation between like RPE and like deceleration load, specifically looking at like Connexon metrics. So is there some type, and it might just be like, how are you feeling today, 1 to 10, but are there some things that you've seen in research that might point toward this HRV and resting heart rate change, either good or bad?
Yeah, and I honestly, in terms of like, oh, hey, there's this research that says this, I don't know any specific research, but I've read time and time again where it's like you want to make sure of subjective and objective data, right? Especially when you're using technology, because as we all know, technology is not always the best 100. It's not always 100%. Things go wrong with it. So, in athlete feedback or client feedback or whoever you're working with, um, that's like extremely important, if not more important than the objective data. So just something simple, like you said, yeah. I've heard, like, I'm sure you've seen things like athlete surveys where they fill out like a survey and it's like 2 or 3 questions, like, are you like, how tired are you on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10? How sore are you on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 to 10? And so tired, sore, and like how much energy do you have? Or talking something a little bit maybe more about like mental fatigue, are you carrying any mental fatigue? And getting those numbers there, like a lot of times you'll find those correlations. And I've seen things too. Um, I've seen like dashboards created by like the Olympic Committee in terms of how their sports scientists do things, and they do gather a lot of subjective feedback from their athletes, and it's very simple. It's nothing crazy. It's just, hey, how are you feeling? Any soreness, fatigue, and that's it. And then you just find any correlations.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think it would be great, obviously, from everything you've just said and everything I've learned about it, to like be able to track objectively heart availability, variability, resting heart rate. But I also, so like I track RPE after practice every single day. But I also pass out Connexon and like hook them to the guy's shorts every day before practice. So it's like a really easy touch point that I know I'll have with everybody because I have to get Connexon with everybody. So now I'm thinking like, do I add a pre-practice question of like, hey, how are you feeling 1 to 10? And just like get some of that data, because that would be really interesting as well if I'm not able to get the objective measures of actual heart rate variability. Are you currently doing any subjective evaluations or subjective questionnaires with your teams? And if so, the one specific question I have is, what are some of the ways that you combat the just like user fatigue of the assessments? Because what I've realized now, after doing it for almost 2 years, is there's probably 60 to 70% of the team that is going to tell me 5 every single day. And then there's 30% of the team that is actually going to give me a relevant answer. And I ask that 70% just to like stay consistent with asking everybody, but I really rely on that 30% to give me actual data. I would love if it was 100%. So do you collect some type of subjective questionnaire? And then how do you kind of combat the user fatigue or some of that um, data, what do they call it? Data like consolidation or whatever with those questions.
Yeah, so I did mess around a little bit last year with getting subjective data, and I had the same issue as you, where it's like some people are really committed to it and they'll be consistent, and other people are just like they'll just click the first number
Yeah.
they see and just press whatever, enter, and it gets frustrating. I do it a lot with my online athletes, and they're pretty good at it. And it may be, I don't know if it's like a culture thing, if it's, they are paying me. So maybe, they're trying to get the most out of their whole training. So they take things a little bit more seriously, where, sometimes in colleges, like, you know, athletes are students and they're just tired and they're just, checking boxes and going through the day. So I've actually had the same challenge as you. I did it a little bit last year, did not find success, and I'm trying to find a way also to figure it out, because like I do find it extremely valuable. And my plan is to start with the team that I have faith will be very committed to it, so that I could have like a proven thing, right? And like, proof that this works, and then eventually grow it into other teams and kind of present it that way. So that's my plan. And I plan to actually start doing that over the summer with this specific team. So
Yeah, I've tried a bunch of different things. I've tried eliminating numbers. It's like, okay, you can't say 5, and then they just say, okay, 4, and just say 4 for every day. I'm like, well, so that doesn't really help. But I've also,
yeah.
and then I've also thought, well, maybe I won't do it as much because I do it every single day after practice. Maybe I just do it like game day -2, game day -1. But then it's like, okay, in the preseason period, do I do it every day, or like, I don't know. There's so much value to it, but actually like executing it at a high level is just like so difficult that I just like go back and forth on it so much. But yeah, it's the ever ending never ending quest to try to get a men's basketball team to answer a subjective questionnaire well is just that, never ending.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet it's not easy.
So if you were to get transplanted into an environment, let's say maybe both, maybe like basketball and football, right? So you had like a 15-person team and maybe like a 100-person team. And it was
Hmm.
like, okay, the goal is to create the most accurate measurements in the pursuit of understanding how athletes are feeling with like whatever that protocol looks like for you, that blends the highest level of accuracy and then also maybe the least amount of invasiveness for an athlete's like day and time. Right. So like if you got put into a hunter's environment and like let's say money was not an option, like money was not like an issue whatsoever. Like what would that protocol look like for you in order to kind of figure out, okay, highest level of accuracy, least amount of athlete invasiveness?
Yeah. A lot of people that I know would probably say this answer as well. In terms of technology, if we're looking at football and basketball and we want to do like fatigue monitoring, I would say force plates would be like the way to go for me, at least, looking at time-based metrics that way. And if I could have a wearable on them and I like, I was confident that they would wear it, then I would have like a wearable, like a Whoop. So those two things there, I think they're both easy to execute. The Whoop obviously takes no time. You just have to wear it and you're getting all this track data. You could also track, like if you start an activity on it, you could get heart rate data as well, which is nice. So you could just see like what intensity and zones they're in. And then using force plates, as we know, with the counter movement jumps and just looking at time-based metrics to monitor fatigue over time. And then if we're getting subjective data as well, man, if I could just have like an iPad that I just pass around, I'm just like, just 1 to 5, how you feeling? Just someone going to each person, 1 to 5, how you feeling? And they just boop, boop, boop. That's all I'm asking is just an accurate measurement that's quick and easy, painless for everyone all around.
That makes a lot of sense. And I ask about like the football to basketball because I feel like the football one just becomes significantly harder unless you're
Yeah.
like, hey, I just care about the top 20% of our team, which I guess is probably legitimate if that's what you decide, because you probably don't care about how the bottom 20% is feeling because they probably will never play. But obviously, if you have a 15-person team versus a 100-person team, that's significantly different. And so, like for us, for example, like we have like 5 Omega Wave units, and we send
Uh-huh.
those 5 Omega Wave units home with like some of our more high workload guys, and we tell them to like get HRV as soon as I wake up. And sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just like show up at the rink and it's like, hey, did you get HRV this morning? Like, no. It's like, oh, okay, well, we just had 3 and 4. Like, it'd be great if you got your HRV last night. So it's like, do we just have them do it here? But then also sometimes they'll wake up, do their life for 3 hours and come to the rink, and it's like, okay, well, how anyway? So it's like a constant battle that we have. So I think it's simple what you're talking about, and it's doable. So probably pretty
Yeah,
applicable for a lot of settings.
right.
One question I wanted to ask, and maybe this transition us a little bit more to like training topics specifically, but you mentioned VO2 max, and it just made me think like there's so much controversy and talk around like conditioning tests. It just seems to be like such a hot topic within our field of like, should you do them? Which ones are good? That's stupid. It doesn't apply. Like, do you think that through your use of the VO2 max with your research that like we've had the best conditioning test all along of just like a VO2 max? And I understand that like logistically it's not always easy because you need a lab and it's not like you can just run uh, 100-person football team through a VO2 max test very easily. But like, let's say you have the access and let's say you have a smaller team. Do you think that that's like the best way to like objectify a conditioning level within an athlete that people should just rely on more if they logistically can?
Yeah, I think so. One metabolic cart's like if you're doing a VO2 max test like on a metabolic cart is extremely accurate. So there's that part of it too. And it gives you a ton of data. So one, you're getting the VO2 max. You're seeing how fast this VO2 max goes up. You're seeing how long someone can last in that as well, right? So you're seeing their general conditioning from that. And from the VO2 max test, you could also get their lactate thresholds. So you could get their aerobic threshold and their anaerobic threshold, which again, you're seeing both sides of it. So I think it's extremely important because like you're getting also like another thing too with the VO2 max test, you're also seeing someone's like, I think it's important, like the psychology part of it, like someone's grit, like how much can they push through, like how much in the pain cave can they go through. And I think that's an important thing to know, like about an athlete, like how much can they push themselves, and you get that with that test. And I think it's the gold standard too. The only issue I could see is if you're dealing with someone that has they're not used to the bike, or they have lower strength in their quads or their lower body, right? Because then that becomes a limiting factor versus the conditioning part of it. Or vice versa, someone has some crazy leg strength and then their conditioning sucks, right? But if you have the good leg strength, then that's not going to limit your conditioning, but the opposite is true. So and I've seen that before where some people will come in the lab and they're generally pretty fit. They're runners, right? And then we have them do the cycling bike test, and then it's not they stop and they have a good VO2 max, but they definitely had some more in them. But what was stopping them was their leg strength. They just got too fatigued and that kind of crapped out. But yeah, I do think like if I had an ideal lab, one of the things I want in it, like a exercise physiology lab, one of the things I want in it is at least a metabolic cart, like so I could perform those VO2 max tests. That would be an ideal situation.
Do you guys VO2 max test your triathlon team in Arizona?
We don't. We do lactate testing with them through, we do it for running and biking. And we do that with lactate readers and pricking their ears. So you prick their ears, the blood goes on the lactate reader, and there's a protocol for that. And then for their cycling and their running, we do that lactate threshold. So we could get their VO2 max from that. So it's not on the metabolic carts, but it is using their bikes and then running on the track. We do that. And that is something that I help out with the staff, with the triathlon coaching staff. So it's a different way of doing it. It's not as accurate or reliable. Obviously, like the fancy, expensive metabolic cart is the way to go. But this is like a side quest of mine that I'm trying to do, is trying to get the triathlon team in the lab so they can do that. And there's rules that I have to kind of get approval. I have to get approval for certain things from the physiology department and all that before I get like athletes in there and all this stuff. But if I could get them in there, I would. And that's kind of my side quest right now.
So I actually work with, well, it's kind of like a transitionary period where one of our coaching assistants is kind of taking over triathlon. But for my first 2 years at Arizona State, I worked with the triathlon team here. And I would be so interested in seeing some of these girls VO2 max, because I don't know, like hearing what they do and seeing what they do, and some of the girls do like top off conditioning. If they like missed a run, they'll do it in the weight room after we lift. And I swear they're at like sprinting speed
Yeah.
I'm like, see them start, go to my office, work on some stuff for a while, come out 20 minutes later, they're at the same pace, just not even, I'm like, how you doing? Oh, I'm doing good. Just like jog, like what their VO2 max is probably incredible. So I would love to see it, because they are some of the most impressive athletes that I've worked with.
Yeah. Yeah, they're insane. And I know obviously ASU has a phenomenal team up there too. So like world-class athletes, and they're yeah, some of the stuff they do is insane. Like they'll go, are you guys familiar with Mount Lemon in Tucson?
Mm-mm.
It's like this mountain that we have here that I usually, like when I'm bored on a Saturday, I'll drive up and it takes like an hour and a half to drive up. And these girls like bike it on weekends. So they'll
Jeez.
bike up and down, which takes like about 3-4 hours. And then we have our strength session after. And I'm like, and they're ready to go. They're not even like tired. It's the craziest thing to me. I'm like, you just biked up a mountain. Like,
I've had
and that,
girls I've had girls say, "Oh yeah, like I passed out this weekend at the meet." I'm like, I react like, "Oh my gosh," like, or
yeah,
and she's like, "Yeah, I'm fine." Like, what are you talking about? And
yeah,
all of them are like, "If you haven't passed out in a race, like you're probably not going very hard." They're like,
yeah.
our heart rate will get to like 215." I'm just like, what in the world?
Insane.
But that does take us to our next point. And Mike, I know you want to talk about this, so you take the question.
Before
But
now,
it is
before
a
we segue there, I have a
yes,
different segue before this segue,
yes,
if you will. Coming back to the lactate testing real quick.
yeah.
When you do that for your triathlon team, how does that then have implication over training? Like, what are you guys doing? Okay, we know these 8 different VO2s or whatever. Like, what does that now mean for training? Like, does that become 8 different training programs, or how does that work?
Yeah, so that's all handled by the triathlon coaches. So they're really good. They're really good at like being transparent in what they do, and they like, talk me through all the plans and all that. But he does write an individual training plan for all the athletes based on those tests. So he sends me all the tests as well, the results on the tests and all that. And I create like a little dashboard for it. And that's for my own purposes and all that. But he writes individual programs based on that regarding like, he looks at their VO2 max, their VLA max, I believe. And I forgot what the other metric is. Their max power output. And yeah, from there he creates their plan and all that. So it's a lot because we had 14 girls this past year. So
Is there like a universal understanding of the difference between a VO2 max on like a metabolic cart and what you would get in terms of VO2 max from like a lactate test? Or is that just like, who knows?
yeah, in terms of like the discrepancy between them, I don't know if there's like an exact like, oh hey, you have to multiply this one by 1.5 and then that's what it'll be on a metabolic
Yeah.
cart. Because I think it depends, a lot of it has to do with human error and user, how the user, the tester for example. So like if how the tester executes it can be different from time to time. So there's not like a direct correlation to the VO2 max on the metabolic cart.
Got you. Have you ever tried doing both on yourself?
I haven't, no. So I've done the VO2 max. Funny you ask, because I've done the VO2 max on the lab metabolic cart, and I actually bought a bike trainer the other day. So that's like the stands where you could put your bike on indoors. So then you just take the back wheel off and you just put it there so you can cycle at home. So and then I ordered a lactate reader with all the little strips and everything and a pricker so that I could do the test on myself in my living room. So that's actually my next little experiment on myself that I'm doing. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm doing essentially the same test that they're doing on myself just to kind of see how it is and how it feels and have fun with it.
I would say you're probably the only triathlon strength coach in the country who's also actively trying to replicate their own training in the living room of their.
I also, the fact that you said do like lactate testing instead of have fun with it, that sounds like my nightmare. I had to do a VO2 max test during my graduate program, and it was like the worst experience of my life. I also hate any type of like conditioning. Like I just did a 30-minute Peloton before this, and it's just like the biggest grind of my day to just like stay on the Peloton for 30 minutes. And I did a VO2 max test, and I absolutely hated it. It was the worst experience of my 2 years there. But yeah, enough about me hating conditioning. Mike, take us to our potentially last point of what you wanted to touch on.
Yeah. There's probably a couple different places that we could have continued to go, but you kind of started to segue there, so we will go there, and we can spend as little or as much time as we want here, but you talked about the triathletes doing all their crits training and then coming in and training with you, like in the weight room. Slightly different stimulus there. So
Mhm.
when it comes to training an endurance athlete in the weight room, just I guess maybe more broad to start, what are just like some of your typical principles, understanding that those two things are slightly different and those adaptations are also slightly different?
Yeah. So in an ideal world, obviously, I would space it out a little bit more. And I try to do that as much as I can with them. If they're doing some crazy session where they're biking up a mountain or running however many miles, they usually do that in the morning. So I like to have the strength sessions in the evening for that reason. So we like the interference effect, right? It's not new to anyone. Everyone knows that it exists, and the goal is to make sure that we're not having that interference be so much, right? We don't want them to be head to head. So with them, I have to be very careful with knowing how much load they're doing and how much already in their training session, and then how much load I'm going to put them through in the weight room. I have to be very careful with that. So the approach I like to take is a minimum effective dose approach with them. And most teams I like to do that, but with them specifically, like that is my main purpose. And it's kind of like hard to, I come from a background where I did a lot of I did mostly bodybuilding, and then I did Olympic lifting, and I did CrossFit for a bit, and I really liked that. That was fun. But I've mostly been always like a strength athlete. That was always my thing. So when I started working with triathlon, one of the guys that I met and talked to, and he's a well-known triathlon strength coach in the private sector, and he works with like the world champion like triathletes and all that stuff. So he has a lot of experience. But one thing he told me was like, you know, you don't know how a triathlon athlete feels in the weight room until you've gone through the same amount of load that they do. Like it's a lot of load, and you have to understand that. So you have to be very careful with how you approach them in the weight room. So when he told me that, I was like, all right, I got to start running. I got to start doing this. So I started running more often, and it's been like a year and a half now. And I've done a half marathon, and I plan on doing another one soon. But I kind of pivoted a bit where now running is my priority, and I do strength training to supplement it. So where before it was like I was all about strength, like I was all about squat, bench, deadlifting, snatch, clean and jerk. Now it's opposite. So it's kind of been a bit of a weird year and a half, very different from what I'm used to. But it's crazy. Like you feel it, right? You feel the residual effects from running or whatever conditioning you're doing. Like yesterday I did 8.5 mile run, and it was like the first bit of it, I was doing it at an easy pace. The second bit of it, it was at a tempo pace. So it was a little bit higher, right? Closer to race pace. And like the end of the day, I was supposed to do an upper body lift, right? So upper body shouldn't interfere as much, but my whole body was so sore. Like my legs especially were sore, but like my whole body was like felt this like fatigue just throughout, and I couldn't do the upper body session. So I had to kind of space it out a little bit more. And there's several reasons for that. One of them is, like I mentioned, the residual fatigue from endurance training. Like that is very like once you're doing a certain amount of mileage and you're going at a certain intensity, like you're gonna feel that carrying on, especially if you're not these girls, these athletes, like they're they're so like great and elite, like they could get through it. Where like someone like me, I'm just an average person, like I wrecked after it. But me being wrecked, I understand that they may feel some fatigue, maybe a little bit, not as much as me, but I know to some extent they're going to feel some fatigue. So we know that. We know from the global standpoint, but then understanding what's happening at like the molecular level, where like it's called like the signal molecular theory. So it's these two pathways that occur based on what you're training, and they're interfering with each other. So one is called the AMPK pathway, and that's the adenosine monophosphate kinase pathway. And this pathway is mostly focused on endurance. So it gets activated when you're doing an endurance training session. And essentially, it's adenosine monophosphate, which we know that is from adenosine triphosphate, ATP, the main energy source, is being broken down to adenosine diphosphate and then further to adenosine monophosphate. Once there's an accumulation of adenosine monophosphate, since you're utilizing the ATP, that kicks off this protein that's a kinase called AMPK. AMPK essentially phosphorylates and activates further proteins. So it's like this, downstream effect. So it activates these other proteins, which then increase glucose utilization, glycolysis, all these things that provide the energy for conditioning, running, whatever endurance event that you're doing. So when you're doing endurance, this signal gets kicked on. Okay. And usually it stays on for up to about 3 hours after your training. So let's say I'm running, it stays on for about 3 hours after I'm training, and then it gets shut off. Now, if you're doing strength training, you have another pathway come on, and that's the mTORC pathway. So that mTORC pathway is similar, where you put a stress on your body. That's strength training. So if you're lifting weights, these proteins, it's a protein complex, mTOR, MLS58, and these other little proteins that are stuck to them. They activate these proteins. They further activate other proteins by phosphorylating them. So it adds a phosphate group to these proteins and it activates them. And that activates essentially protein synthesis. So you got the AMPK pathway for endurance training and the mTORC pathway for strength training. So you have two different pathways for the two different stressors you're putting on your body, and they conflict with each other because the AMPK pathway, it's been proven, but not really, that it essentially shuts off the mTORC pathway. So if you're doing endurance, let's say you lift weights, and so that mTORC pathway is turned on, and then you do an endurance training right after, the AMPK pathway gets turned on and slowly shuts off that mTORC. And different research has shown different things, that it either shuts it off like a light switch, completely shuts it off. And other research has shown that it's like, it doesn't shut it off completely, but it definitely diminishes the amount of protein synthesis you're getting. So the goal, we don't know to what extent, but we know that there's some type of interference. And the goal is to minimize this amount of interference that we got going on between those two. And that's doing things by making sure you're spacing it out correctly, making sure that you're paying attention to intensities. So if I'm having a really intense strength session, then maybe space out the endurance session and then also make it a lower intensity session, so it's not high and high, right? And so you're trying to just make sure that they're staying away from each other as much as possible and not completely stunting what they can do. And like the mTOR pathway for protein synthesis, that usually lasts up to 18 hours after your session. And we usually know that, right? Like you work out and you know that your body then repairs itself and all that to grow muscles and all that good stuff. So that lasts up to 18 hours. So during those 18 hours, you're trying to maximize as much as you can get. So maybe it's not the smartest thing to put a high intensity endurance session even 12 hours after that, right? Like try to wait those 24 hours, give it that rest, and then hit that endurance session so you're not getting that interference.
Yeah, that mTOR pathway brings me back to my undergrad and graduate degree. That's like the first time I've heard it, and you put it very eloquently of how it's relevant because you learn it about it in undergrad and it's like, what does this matter? But one thing that I've been thinking about recently was the structure of how I want to go about our training for the upcoming off season. And typically what I do is I'll train before we go out onto the court, just to keep things consolidated for the guys so they don't have to like come train, go home, come back. It's just like all in one place. And I also get good feedback that like, yeah, I like to come in and train beforehand because it's kind of just like a warm up to get my body going before we go to the court. But now I'm realizing that like, while that is all relevant and all those psychological things and the logistical nature of consolidating an athlete's schedule, I think is helpful for them. And I think those things have to be factored into the equation. But from everything you've just said from a scientific standpoint, that potential structure might not be the best for maximizing adaptation with the things that I'm trying to do. If there was so one thing that I've been thinking about doing this off season was doing a morning-ish. So I don't know, as early as 8, 9, 9:30. And then we do our court stuff in the afternoon at 1, 2. And I typically don't like to go after because trying to get basketball players off the court to come train, and then the quality of the training goes down. So that probably is something that you have to factor in as well. But with everything you've just said, would you think that doing a morning session within the weight room and giving them even 3 hours would be potentially more beneficial for adaptation from everything I try to do in the weight room before they go to the court if I were to structure it, as opposed to weight room, literally walk from the weight room to the court and start their on-court stuff? Because I'm assuming that basketball, while it is a lot of different energy systems and things going on, it probably is more so MPK than mTOR, if
Right.
you'd agree with that.
Yeah. And I think ideally, right, spacing it out would probably be the best option. But then, from like the perspective of like a coach, you also think about like, oh, hey, like scheduling wise, do they have time? How much, if they're having an 8 a.m. strength session, are they getting enough sleep the night before, or is it too early for them? Like, I don't know what that answer is for basketball for your team, but yeah, like I do think that, and I think like having a 3-hour break too just gives them that ability to rest a little bit, eat, rest, and get that get better qualities for their practice versus going back to back. And we also know like the law of diminishing returns. When you're having an extended session going from strength right onto the basketball court, there's like little break in between that. It's a bit rushed and quality goes down after a certain period of time. So if I were to say, based on the science side of it and looking at the interference, yeah, spacing it out would be the way to go. I think it just brings more benefit overall. And then you have the added benefit of like, okay, you have some time to kind of recuperate, eat, do what you need to do, and, kind of restart again for that quality practice.
Yeah, I think even just like touching, one thing I was thinking about is, especially for the individuals that need to gain weight, it's just like a big block of time where there's getting like no caloric intake. Maybe it's just like a shake, but they don't really finish it because they're about to go out to the court. And then it's like, okay, they've just went an hour within the weight room with me, a 15-minute transition period, and then an hour and a half on the court. And you're looking at 3.5 hours of very minimal calories. And then I think
Yeah.
also to your point that I thought was interesting is like the mTOR pathway is going to bring on like protein synthesis. And even if we could like get a 2-3 hour window of like good nutrients and squeeze what we can out of that little window of mTOR being activated before we kick on AMPK, I think that would be worthwhile to have. I mean, obviously it's going to be worthwhile to have 2-3 hours as opposed to no time before that kind of signaling shuts off.
Right. And then, yeah, like you mentioned, the mTOR pathway is activated by 2 ways. And one of them is, like I said, the stressor from exercise or growth factors like insulin, IGF-1, right? So either one of those and amino acids. So you do have to have that amino acid. That's essentially a starting factor for mTOR to be activated. So that is a requirement. So you need either the stressor or growth factors and amino acids. So if you're giving them that opportunity to, to eat after, you're kind of enhancing that pathway to kind of kickstart and continue on.
Interesting.
Hunter, do you guys ever complain about like a change in actual like perception of skill coming off of let's say some kind of upper body touch coming onto the court?
Guys will say it in the weight room, like, "Oh, I'm going to be broke today," and then they leave. I take whatever 10 minutes to get connects on together and take it over to the court, and by the time I get over there, they're just like shooting and not saying a word about it. So maybe it's because I'm not doing crazy enough stuff in the weight room, but I also think to your point, Day, earlier, like minimal effective dose. It's like I think that if I were to program so much that 30 minutes after they're done and after 100 shots, they're still like, man, I'm dead. That's probably like maybe a little bit too much. So I deal with it in the moment when they're like training. They're like, oh, this is going to mess up my jump shot. And then they get over the court and they're not thinking about it. That negative effect is probably gone.
Yeah, I wonder about it because like we have guys sometimes when we do like a lower body touch, for example, they'll step out on the ice and they'll be like, oh, I actually feel way better. When we do an upper body touch, they'll step out and they'll just be like, for the first 15 minutes of practice, my hands like don't feel right. Which like it makes sense, right? Like there's local fatigue of the muscles in your upper body, and there's also like some kind of central fatigue, right? So it's probably a little bit slower, of a system. And then if it's like a 40-minute practice though, if the first 15 minutes are potentially a lower value of practice, then like you're probably, that's a large percentage, almost 50% of practice is now a worse percentage of practice. Like I'm now taking away from the skill component of practice, the most important part of the sport preparation. So I think about that all the time. But like from an actual fatigue standpoint, it makes total sense that would happen. So I don't know, just food for thought, I guess. But for myself, I've definitely made mistakes. Because I've also, like when I was a college strength coach, I had swimming everywhere I was as a college strength coach. And you'd always get like swimmers either right before, like right after practice. And every time you get them right after practice, they're just like crush. And you're like, all right, well, like, let's crush you again. So I've definitely made mistakes in that regard. But as we've been about an hour and 10 a day, we don't want to take up too much of your night here. So we'll start to wrap up. And our very last question is a question that's powered by Tiny Motion. And that is, what is something that you do or think that a majority of the field would disagree with? And that's just to hold you to something that we haven't already spoken about so far in this podcast.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot, and I, going through, my mind goes 80 different directions. And I would say, like, I think one of my biggest things, and I don't think that the whole field disagrees with this. Like, there's some that highly agree with it, but one of the things I stand very firmly on is that, like, I'm huge on keeping it simple, and keeping it simple, not overcomplicating it. And I think good training doesn't have to be always an hour long. That's my thing. I know usually it's scheduled for, like, especially in college athletics, an hour session. And I have teams that come in and out within, 30, 40 minutes. And I'm okay with that. I care about quality of work and all that. So keeping it simple and effective is my main thing. And one thing I think almost every team can benefit from, and whether they like it or not, is like just plain bodybuilding. That's like, I think plain bodybuilding could like help so many teams. And I know a lot of teams want to do fun stuff with like banded jumps and all these crazy things, but I'm very much like, I put a lot of my teams through simple bodybuilding workouts that are very, very, it may seem very, very boring. And from week to week, there's really no changes except for certain variables in terms of intensity and volume. And I personally love the boringness of bodybuilding. Other people don't, but yeah, I'd say bodybuilding is one of the best forms of training, I think, for most teams, and obviously not all year round, but throughout the year. And I think it should be included and respected a little bit more.
One of the things about working in college that bothered me the most was the standard hour slot. Because there are some days where I'm like, I actually want 20 minutes. And there are some days where I'm like, I want like 80. But
Yeah,
it's like, it's very rarely do I want 60 minutes with a team. But that's what you always get, So you get a team out in 30 minutes, and the coach is like, dude, they're not training hard enough. It's like, well, that's
yeah,
just literally because I could have trained for 25 minutes and then sat in a circle for 25 minutes, and then you would have appreciated that more. But
sometimes I'm programming, and in my head I'm like, all right, I got an hour, so I try to fill up the hour, and then I'm like, what am I doing? Like, I'm just giving these athletes like stuff that's not going to benefit them or anything. And I just, like, I've gotten into the mindset of like, all right, I'm just gonna do what I want to do and what I think is best for them, and if that's 40 minutes, it's 40 minutes.
as we've gone through this conversation, you're obviously a very smart human being. You have an incredibly impressive background, and you've done some educational stuff in the past. Where are some places that people could find some of that if they were interested, or just reach out to you, ask questions?
Yeah, if someone were to reach out to me, Instagram is probably the easiest way. So my Instagram, I don't even know my handle. I think it's just my full name. I'm looking it up right now as we speak. Yeah, Dayannara.Muñoz. So just first name, last name, or they can shoot me an email at dayannaramunoz@arizona.edu. And if you're looking for any information or anything that I've put out before, If you YouTube Zor Fitness, ZOAR, that's the online coaching business that I work with two other coaches, and it's a big CrossFitty, so don't hate on it, but we do talk a lot about just normal strength and conditioning stuff, and yeah, we have some podcasts and all that out there.
CrossFit's not the worst thing in the world. Not the worst thing in the world.
It's not. It's great.
Yeah.
Mike has to say that, or his girlfriend would be pissed at him. So,
Day, appreciate your time.
Thank you, Day.
Yeah, this has been really, really good.